The sun rose late over the frozen landscape of Western Russia in the winter of 1941, casting pale light across rows of barbed wire that stretched toward the horizon. Inside the wire, tens of thousands of men huddled in holes they had dug into the frozen earth with bare hands and scraps of metal. The temperature had fallen to 30 degrees below zero. These were Soviet soldiers, prisoners of the German Wehrmacht, and they were dying at a rate that would soon reach 5,000 per day. The camps had no barracks. German military planners had made no provision for housing the massive numbers of prisoners taken during the opening months of Operation Barbarossa. The invasion had begun on the 22nd of June, 1941, and within 5 months, more than 3 million Soviet soldiers had fallen into German hands. Now, in October and November of that terrible year, the consequences of this neglect became catastrophic. Men died of exposure, huddling together for warmth that never came. They died of typhus and dysentery, diseases that spread like wildfire through the crowded pits and trenches. Above all, they died of hunger. The rations allocated to Soviet prisoners were calculated with deliberate cruelty. 700 calories per day, roughly 1/4 of what a human being needs to survive. The bread, when it came, was made from sugar beet husks mixed with sawdust and straw flour. Desperate prisoners ate grass and leaves when they could find them, though winter had stripped the landscape bare. Some resorted to eating the bark of trees. Others simply lay down in their holes and waited for death, too weak to move, too starved to care. German guards watched this slow extermination with varying degrees of concern. Some were horrified. Others had been taught by years of Nazi propaganda that Slavic peoples were subhuman, barely worthy of the bullet it would take to kill them quickly. The official policy was clear enough. At a conference of German state secretaries in Berlin in May of 1941, before the invasion had even begun, officials had calculated coldly that millions would surely starve as a result of prioritizing food supplies for the Wehrmacht and for Germany itself. The starvation of Soviet prisoners was not an accident. It was policy. By February of 1942, 2 million of the 3.3 million Soviet soldiers captured up to that point had died. This represented one of the highest sustained death rates for any mass atrocity in human history. In October of 1941 alone, nearly 5,000 Soviet prisoners died every single day. The death toll was so immense that German authorities could not keep accurate records. Bodies were stacked like cordwood, then burned or buried in mass graves. Many simply froze where they lay, their corpses remaining in the camps until spring thaw. For those who survived, a terrible question presented itself with each passing day. How long could they endure? And more importantly, what would they do to survive? The answer to that question was complicated by an order that had come from Moscow on the 16th of August, 1941. Order number 2, 70, signed by Joseph Stalin himself, declared that there were no Soviet prisoners of war, only traitors to the motherland. Any commander or commissar who surrendered to the enemy was to be considered a malicious deserter. If they ever returned to Soviet territory, they would be shot on sight. Their families would be arrested. Even ordinary soldiers who surrendered faced a grim fate. Their families would lose all state assistance and benefits. They would be branded as relatives of traitors. The order was clear in its intent. Soviet soldiers were to fight to the death. Surrender was treason. Capture was betrayal. There could be no excuses, no consideration of circumstances. A soldier surrounded by overwhelming German forces, cut off from supplies, facing certain death if he continued to fight, was still expected to die rather than raise his hands. If he was wounded and captured while unconscious, he was still guilty. If his entire unit was encircled and annihilated, leaving him no choice but captivity, he was still a traitor. Stalin's order reflected his obsession with perceived disloyalty and his rage at the catastrophic defeats of the first months of the war. The Red Army had collapsed in the face of the German onslaught. Entire field armies had been surrounded and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had surrendered, many in the first hours of combat, shell-shocked and leaderless after the German surprise attack. Stalin needed someone to blame, and he chose to blame the victims. The impact of Order 270 on the men dying in German camps was profound. They understood that even if they somehow survived, even if Germany lost the war and they were liberated, they faced execution or the Gulag upon their return to the Soviet Union. Their families were already suffering. Some had been arrested, others had been evicted from their homes, their ration cards revoked, left to starve in a country where everything was controlled by the state. In the camps, this knowledge created a peculiar form of despair. The prisoners were caught between two totalitarian systems, each one offering only death. If they remained in German captivity, they would likely starve or freeze before spring. If they somehow escaped and made it back to Soviet lines, they would be shot as traitors or sent to die slowly in Siberian labor camps. There was no good choice, only degrees of doom. It was into this impossible situation that the Germans began to offer a third option. In the spring and summer of 1942, as the Wehrmacht prepared for its second major offensive in the east, German commanders faced a serious manpower shortage. The Eastern Front was consuming soldiers at an unsustainable rate. Every division was below strength. Replacements from Germany could not keep pace with casualties. The army needed bodies, and there were millions of Soviet prisoners slowly dying in the camps. At first, the recruitment was informal and unauthorized. Individual German commanders, desperate to fill out their units, began pulling prisoners from the camps to work as drivers, cooks, stable hands, and laborers. These men were called Hilfswillige, voluntary helpers, a term quickly shortened to Hiwi. They were not armed at first, not trusted with weapons. They simply performed rear echelon duties, freeing German soldiers for frontline service. The Hiwis kept their Soviet uniforms initially, though they stripped off any badges of rank or Soviet insignia. Gradually, they were given German uniforms, usually worn and threadbare cast-offs, but warmer and better than the rags they had worn in the camps. More importantly, they were fed. Not well, not generously, but enough to survive. For a man who had been starving, this was enough. By the end of 1941, before any official policy existed, as many as 10% of the ration strength in some German divisions consisted of these Soviet auxiliaries. The Army High Command, when they discovered what was happening, initially ordered the practice stopped. Germany was waging a racial and ideological war against the Soviet Union. The idea of arming Slavic Untermenschen was anathema to Nazi ideology, but the demands of the front were inexorable. In 1942, as German losses continued to mount, the politicians bowed to military necessity. The Hiwis were officially recognized and organized. From this beginning, a larger and more systematic recruitment program emerged. The Germans began forming entire battalions of former Soviet soldiers organized along ethnic lines. These were the Ostbataljonen, the Eastern battalions. Ukrainians, Cossacks, Balts, Caucasians, and others were separated out and formed into units nominally based on their nationality. The recruitment focused initially on non-Russian ethnic groups, populations that had suffered under Soviet rule and might be more willing to fight against Stalin's regime. The motivations of those who volunteered were complex and varied. Some were driven by genuine anti-communist ideology. They had seen their families destroyed during collectivization, had witnessed the terror of the purges, had suffered under the brutal inefficiency of the Soviet system. For these men, the Germans represented a chance, however slim, to strike back at the regime that had oppressed them. Others had no such grand political vision. They simply wanted to live. In the camps, they had watched their comrades die by the thousands, had felt their own strength ebbing day by day. When German recruiters appeared offering food, shelter, and a way out of the camps, they took it. They told themselves they would serve in non-combat roles, that they would never fight against their own countrymen, that they would desert at the first opportunity. They were lying to themselves, and on some level they knew it, but the alternative was death. Still others were motivated by a desire to protect their families. German recruiters were not above threatening that continued resistance would mean reprisals against relatives in occupied territories. They also made promises that cooperation would be rewarded, that families would be taken care of, that after the war there would be opportunities in the new order. These promises were rarely kept, but desperate men believed them anyway. By mid-1943, several 100,000 former Soviet citizens were serving in the German armed forces. They were organized into Ostbataljonen of about 600 to 800 men each, with German officers and NCOs making up roughly 10% of the strength. They wore German field grey uniforms with special insignia marking them as Eastern troops. Their weapons were mostly captured Soviet equipment or obsolete German arms. The Germans never fully trusted them. Ostbataljonen were assigned to rear area security, anti-partisan operations, and coastal defense. They freed German units for frontline combat, but were rarely used in direct action against the Red Army. The fear of mass desertion was too great. To prevent this, German commanders stationed blocking detachments behind Osttruppen units, ready to shoot any who tried to flee. The Eastern troops understood that they were expendable, valued only for their utility, despised for their origins. Among the most prominent figures to emerge from this murky world of collaboration and survival was Lieutenant General Andrey Andreevich Vlasov. Before his capture in July of 1942, Vlasov had been one of the Soviet Union's most celebrated commanders. He had led the 20th Army in the defense of Moscow, helping to stop the German advance in the winter of 1941. His picture had appeared in Pravda as one of the defenders of the capital. He had been decorated, promoted, entrusted with important commands. But in the spring of 1942, Vlasov had been sent to lift the siege of Leningrad with the Second Shock Army. The operation was a disaster. The army was surrounded in the Volkhov swamps, cut off and annihilated. Vlasov, abandoned by higher command and betrayed by inadequate support, was captured by German forces. He was 41 years old, a career officer who had risen through the ranks by skill and political acumen, a man who had believed in the Soviet system. His capture changed him. In German custody, Vlasov met Baltic German officers who presented him with a vision of a Russian liberation movement, an army of former Soviet soldiers who would fight not for Germany, but for a Russia freed from Bolshevism. The idea appealed to Vlasov for reasons both idealistic and practical. He had become disillusioned with Stalin's regime, had seen its cruelty and incompetence up close. He believed, or convinced himself to believe, that millions of Soviet citizens would rally to a movement that promised to overthrow Stalin while defending Russia itself. The Germans, for their part, saw Vlasov as a useful propaganda tool. They plastered his name and image across leaflets dropped over Soviet lines. They created the fiction of a Russian liberation army, issuing shoulder patches and encouraging prisoners to volunteer to join Vlasov's forces. Hundreds of thousands of Hiwis and Osttruppen wore these patches and claimed to be part of the Russian Liberation Army, but it was all propaganda. No such army existed. Hitler refused to authorize its formation, fearing that a genuine Russian anti-communist movement might actually succeed in overthrowing Stalin, which would interfere with German plans to colonize the East. So the Osttruppen remained what they had always been: auxiliaries, cannon fodder, men caught between two hells, trusted by neither side, their lives measured out in the brutally simple calculus of survival. They served the Germans because the alternative was starvation. They fought their former countrymen because German officers stood behind them with loaded weapons. They hoped, with fading conviction, that somehow they would survive the war and find a way to avoid both German and Soviet justice. By the end of 1942, approximately 1 million former Soviet citizens were serving in some capacity with the German armed forces. They represented a massive failure of Soviet morale, a damning indictment of Stalin's regime. But they also represented a peculiar tragedy, a population caught in a historical trap with no escape. They had made the choice that seemed to offer life over death. History would judge them harshly for it, but in the frozen camps of 1941 and 42, as thousands died every day, the choice seemed almost inevitable. The spring of 1942 brought a temporary thaw to the Eastern Front, both in temperature and in German military policy. As the frozen corpses of winter began to emerge from melting snow, Wehrmacht commanders faced the reality that their losses had been catastrophic. The failed drive on Moscow had cost hundreds of thousands of casualties. Every division was understrength. The planned summer offensive toward the Caucasus oil fields would require manpower that simply did not exist in sufficient numbers within Germany itself. It was in this context that the recruitment of former Soviet soldiers transitioned from improvised necessity to organized policy. In the spring and summer of 1942, the Wehrmacht High Command issued formal guidelines for the creation and deployment of Eastern troops. The Ostbataillonen were to be standardized, properly equipped, and integrated into the German order of battle. What had begun as isolated initiatives by individual commanders became a systematic program involving hundreds of thousands of men. The recruitment process varied depending on location and ethnicity. In prisoner of war camps, German and collaborator recruiters moved through the wire enclosures, addressing crowds of starving men. The pitch was simple and effective. Join the German war effort and you will be fed, clothed, and given a purpose. Refuse and you will remain here to die. For most prisoners, particularly those who had already endured months of starvation and disease, the choice required little deliberation. Survival trumped ideology, trumped loyalty, trumped everything. The recruitment focused heavily on non-Russian nationalities. Ukrainians, who had suffered through the terror famine of the early 1930s, were considered prime candidates. The Germans believed with some justification that Ukrainian resentment of Soviet rule ran deep enough to overcome any reluctance to serve a foreign occupier. Cossacks, whose traditional way of life had been systematically destroyed by collectivization, were similarly targeted. Baltic peoples from Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, whose countries had been forcibly absorbed into the Soviet Union only in 1940, were recruited with promises of eventual independence. Caucasian peoples presented a special opportunity. Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, Chechens, and others from the mountains and valleys of the Caucasus had their own grievances against Moscow. Many harbored dreams of national independence that predated the Bolshevik Revolution. German recruiters played on these aspirations, suggesting that cooperation with Germany would lead to the restoration of sovereign Caucasian states after the war. These promises were worthless, as subsequent German occupation policies would demonstrate, but in the desperate circumstances of 1942, men chose to believe them. The organizational structure of the Ostbataillonen reflected both German military efficiency and German racial prejudice. Each battalion was to consist of approximately 600 to 800 men, organized into 3 or 4 rifle companies and a heavy weapons company. The German cadre, consisting of officers and senior non-commissioned officers, made up roughly 10% of the total strength. These Germans held all positions of real authority. They commanded companies, controlled heavy weapons, and maintained discipline. The rank and file were Soviet volunteers, though the term volunteer stretched the definition considerably. Some had genuinely chosen to serve. Others had been coerced through threats or starvation. Still others had joined with the intention of deserting at the first opportunity, hoping to use their German uniforms and weapons to make their way back to Soviet lines or to join partisan groups. The Germans were aware of this last category and took extensive precautions to prevent desertion. Each Ost battalion was assigned a German liaison officer whose primary responsibility was to monitor loyalty and report any signs of unreliability. Behind the eastern battalions, German security troops maintained blocking positions, ready to shoot anyone who attempted to flee. The message was clear. The Osttruppen were not trusted allies. They were expendable assets, useful tools that might turn against their wielders at any moment. The uniforms issued to Osttruppen told their own story of ambiguity and improvisation. The basic uniform was German field grey, the standard Feldgrau worn by the Wehrmacht. This immediately marked the wearer as serving Germany, a fact that would prove fatal if they were captured by Soviet forces. But the uniforms were distinguished by special insignia that identified them as Eastern troops rather than Germans. The most common marking was a shield-shaped patch worn on the right sleeve, displaying a swastika within a diamond or rhombus, flanked by stylized wings. The patch came in several variations, embroidered in different colors depending on nationality and unit. Some battalions wore national insignia as well, small flags or emblems representing Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, or other subject peoples. The intention was to foster unit pride and national identity, to convince the volunteers that they were fighting for their own countries rather than simply serving as German auxiliaries. Rank insignia presented a particular challenge. The Germans devised 3 separate systems of shoulder boards and collar tabs for use by Osttruppen. One system was intended for Russian and Ukrainian units. A second was designed for Asian and Caucasian formations. A third was created specifically for Cossack units, incorporating traditional Cossack rank structures. In practice, the implementation of these systems was chaotic. Units wore whatever insignia they could obtain, often mixing elements from different systems or simply using captured Soviet rank badges. The weapons issued to Ostbataillonen were almost universally inferior to those carried by German troops. The standard rifle was often a captured Soviet Mosin Nagant, a sturdy but outdated bolt-action weapon. Machine guns might be Soviet Degtyarevs or Maxims, German MG-34s that had been rendered obsolete by newer models, or even captured French or Czech weapons left over from earlier campaigns. Artillery and heavy weapons, when provided at all, consisted of obsolete or captured pieces. The message implicit in this second-rate equipment was unmistakable. Osttruppen were not trusted with Germany's best weapons. Training for the Eastern battalions took place at several locations. The most important was a camp at Dabendorf, south of Berlin, where a training center for Russian volunteers was established in the summer of 1942. Here, recruits underwent a program that combined basic military instruction with intensive anti-Bolshevik indoctrination. The training emphasized small unit tactics, light infantry skills, and anti-partisan operations. These were the missions for which Osttruppen were considered most suitable. The ideological component of training was overseen by Russian émigré officers and German propaganda specialists. Recruits attended lectures on the evils of Bolshevism, the supposed Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy, and the vision of a new Russia freed from communist tyranny. They were shown films and given reading material, much of it produced by the Wehrmacht propaganda department. The goal was to convince the volunteers that they were not traitors, but liberators, not collaborators, but patriots fighting to free their homeland from an illegitimate regime. For many recruits, this propaganda fell on deaf ears. They nodded along, repeated the slogans when required, but privately harbored no illusions about their situation. They were serving the Germans to survive, nothing more. Others, particularly those with genuine anti-Soviet convictions, embraced the message. They convinced themselves that Germany would win the war, that Hitler would allow the creation of independent states in the East, that their service would be vindicated by history. These true believers were a minority, but they existed in sufficient numbers to provide a core of reliable soldiers in many battalions. The motivations of those who joined the Osttruppen defied simple categorization. At one extreme were the ideological anti-communists, men who had suffered personal tragedies under Soviet rule and saw collaboration with Germany as justified resistance. At the other extreme were pure opportunists, men who would have served anyone who offered food and safety, devoid of political conviction. Between these poles existed a spectrum of partial motivations, conflicting loyalties, and moral compromises. A Ukrainian peasant whose family had starved during the Holodomor had reason to hate Stalin's regime with a passion that bordered on madness. If the Germans offered him a chance to strike back, to wear a uniform and carry a weapon and be part of something that opposed the system that had murdered his parents and siblings, why would he refuse? That the Germans viewed him as subhuman, that they planned to colonize his homeland and reduce his people to slavery. These were abstractions. His family's suffering was concrete. A young Russian soldier captured in the first weeks of the war, before he had fired a shot or formed any clear understanding of what the conflict meant, faced a different calculation. He had no particular hatred of Stalin, no burning ideological commitment. He had been swept into the Red Army by conscription, given minimal training, and thrown into combat against an enemy whose tactics and equipment proved vastly superior. Within days, he was a prisoner. Within weeks, he was starving. When German recruiters appeared, he made the choice that seemed to offer life. Later, when he understood fully what he had done, it was too late to unmake the decision. A Cossack cavalry officer, descendant of warriors who had fought for the Tsar, whose lands had been seized during collectivization, whose relatives had been shot or exiled, brought yet another set of motivations to his service. He viewed Stalin as the enemy of his people, the destroyer of Cossack traditions and autonomy. If fighting alongside the Germans meant a chance to restore Cossack independence, to reclaim the steps that his ancestors had ridden, then it was a bargain worth making. The Faustian nature of this bargain, the price that would ultimately be extracted, he chose not to consider. German officers who commanded Osttruppen held varying opinions about their reliability and worth. Some viewed them with contempt, as barely human tools to be used and discarded. Others developed a grudging respect, particularly for units that performed well in combat. A few, mostly those who had spent time in Russia before the war, or who had ideological sympathy with the liberation movement, genuinely believed in the potential of the Eastern volunteers. The fundamental problem, recognized by perceptive officers on both sides, was that the Osttruppen were being asked to serve a regime that despised them. Nazi ideology classified Slavic peoples as racially inferior, suitable only for slavery and exploitation. The contradiction at the heart of the Osttruppen program was that it required Russians and Ukrainians to fight loyally for a cause that, if victorious, would enslave them. Some German officers tried to obscure this contradiction with talk of liberation and partnership. Others simply ignored it, focusing on the immediate military utility of having additional manpower. The volunteers themselves navigated this contradiction in different ways. Some genuinely believed or forced themselves to believe that Hitler's racial ideology would be moderated after victory, that a place would be found for loyal collaborators in the new order. Others took a more cynical view, planning to use their positions to survive until circumstances changed. Still others simply tried not to think about the future at all, focusing on getting through each day. By the end of 1942, the Osttruppen had become a significant component of German military strength in the East. Approximately 175,000 men served in various Ostlegionen, the ethnic legions organized by nationality. Hundreds of thousands more served as Hiwis, unorganized auxiliaries attached to German divisions. The total number of former Soviet citizens in German military service approached 1 million. This massive collaboration presented Soviet authorities with a propaganda disaster and a security nightmare: Stalin's order. 270 had declared all prisoners to be traitors, but the scale of recruitment to German service suggested that the problem went far beyond individual cowardice. Millions of Soviet citizens, when given the opportunity, had chosen to serve Germany rather than remain loyal to the Soviet state. This implied a level of alienation and resentment that threatened the entire ideological foundation of the regime. The Soviet response was to double down on terror. In April of 1943, Stalin authorized the creation of SMERSH, an acronym for Smrt Spionum, death to spies. This new counterintelligence organization, headed by Viktor Abakumov, was given sweeping powers to hunt down collaborators, deserters, and suspected traitors. SMERSH operated both behind Soviet lines and in German-occupied territory, working with partisan groups to identify and eliminate those who had gone over to the enemy. SMERSH made the Osttruppen's position even more precarious. If they deserted back to Soviet lines, SMERSH would be waiting. If they were captured in combat, SMERSH would interrogate them. If they somehow survived the war, SMERSH would hunt them down during repatriation. The organization became synonymous with implacable vengeance, a promise that collaboration would be punished without mercy or exception. For the Osttruppen, caught between German distrust and Soviet vengeance, the future narrowed to a series of increasingly desperate gambles. They could continue serving Germany and hope for an Axis victory that seemed less likely with each passing month. They could attempt to desert, risking immediate execution by German blocking detachments or slower death at the hands of SMERSH. Or they could simply endure, performing their assigned duties, fighting when ordered to fight, and hoping that somehow, impossibly, they might survive to see a world in which their choices would be understood, if not forgiven. Most chose the last option, because it was the only one that offered even the illusion of agency. The architect of the grandest of these illusions was Andrey Vlasov. Throughout 1943, even as Hitler refused to authorize the formation of a true Russian liberation army, Vlasov worked tirelessly to create the political and ideological framework for such a force. He wrote manifestos and gave speeches. He met with German officials, arguing that only a genuine Russian government in exile could rally the millions of Soviet citizens who opposed Stalin, but who would never fight for a Nazi Germany that viewed them as subhuman. Vlasov's vision was of a democratic Russia, freed from Bolshevik tyranny but independent of German control. He understood that this was anathema to Hitler's plans for the East. But he hoped, with increasing desperation, that Germany's military situation would deteriorate to the point where Hitler would have no choice but to accept Russian autonomy as the price of continued resistance against the Red Army. It was a reasonable calculation based on an unrealistic premise. Hitler would never voluntarily surrender German dominance in the East. By the time the Führer was forced to accept the creation of the ROA, it would be far too late to matter. The first combat operations assigned to Osttruppen units took place far from the main battle lines. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1942 and continuing into 1943, Eastern battalions were deployed primarily against Soviet partisan forces operating in the vast occupied territories behind the German front. These operations took the volunteers into the forests and swamps of Belarusia, the villages of central Ukraine, and the rural districts where German control existed only along major roads and rail lines. The partisan war was brutal and without mercy on either side. Soviet partisan units operating under directives from Moscow engaged in sabotage, assassination, and attacks on German supply lines. They derailed trains, ambushed convoys, murdered collaborators, and disappeared into wilderness areas where German troops hesitated to follow. The German response was characterized by massive reprisals against civilian populations suspected of supporting the partisans. Collective punishment that killed thousands of innocent people and drove many more into active resistance. Into this savage environment came the Ostbataillonen. German commanders viewed them as ideal for anti-partisan operations because they knew the terrain, spoke the local languages, and could distinguish between genuine civilians and partisan sympathizers in ways that German troops could not. The volunteers had local knowledge that made them effective hunters. They understood the rhythms of village life, recognized which families had sons of military age who might be with the partisans, knew the hiding places in forests they had played in as children. But this same local knowledge created profound moral complications. The Osttruppen were not hunting anonymous enemies in a foreign land. They were operating in their own regions, sometimes within kilometers of their family homes. The partisans they fought were their countrymen, men who spoke their language and shared their culture. In some cases, the volunteers recognized specific individuals among the partisan bands, former neighbors or distant relatives, or men they had served alongside in the Red Army before capture. The 642 Ost Battalion, a composite unit formed in the late summer of 1942, provides an example of how these operations unfolded. The battalion consisted primarily of Ukrainians and Russians from the western regions of the Soviet Union, supplemented by a smaller number of Cossacks and Belarusians. Its German cadre numbered approximately 60 men, including the commander, company officers, and key non-commissioned officers. The unit was based initially near Mogilev in Belarusia, tasked with securing a stretch of railroad vital to German logistics. The battalion's first operation came in September of 1942. Partisan attacks had become increasingly bold in the region, with several successful ambushes of German convoys and the derailment of 2 supply trains. The 642 was ordered to conduct a sweep through suspected partisan base areas in the forests west of the rail line. The operation was to be a cordon and search, surrounding villages believed to harbor partisans and searching for weapons, supplies, and suspects. The night before the operation, the battalion assembled in a clearing near the forest edge. German officers briefed their counterparts in the eastern companies, using maps and aerial photographs to designate search sectors. A Russian-speaking liaison officer translated, though most of the volunteers understood enough German by this point to follow the basic plan. The volunteers cleaned their weapons, checked their ammunition, and tried to prepare mentally for what the next day would bring. At dawn, the battalion moved into the forest in company columns. The morning was cool and misty, with visibility limited to 50 meters in the dense timber. The volunteers moved quietly, years of hunting experience making them better at forest movement than their German supervisors. They advanced toward the first village on their route, a collection of perhaps 30 wooden houses clustered around a small church. As they approached, a burst of rifle fire cracked from the tree line ahead. The lead platoon dropped to the ground, returning fire toward the muzzle flashes. More shots came from the flanks, evidence of an organized ambush. The company commander, a German lieutenant, began shouting orders, directing one section to suppress the partisan positions while another maneuvered to envelop them. For the volunteers, this moment crystallized the full horror of their situation. The shots being fired at them came from Soviet rifles, Mosin Nagants, identical to the ones most of them carried. The men shooting at them were Russians, or Ukrainians, or Belarusians, just like themselves. Some of the volunteers could hear voices shouting in Russian from the partisan positions, coordinating fire and movement with the same commands they had learned in Red Army training. The firefight lasted perhaps 20 minutes. The partisans, outnumbered and unable to withstand the battalion's enveloping movement, broke contact and withdrew deeper into the forest. The 642 pursued for several hundred meters, then halted on orders from the German commander, who feared leading his force into a prepared kill zone. 2 volunteers had been killed in the exchange, 3 more wounded. The partisan casualties were unknown, though blood trails suggested at least some had been hit. After the ambush, the battalion continued to the village. The inhabitants, mostly women, children and old men, stood in silent groups watching as the soldiers spread through the settlement. The German officers ordered a house-to-house search. The volunteers moved through homes they recognized as identical to the ones they had grown up in, searching for hidden weapons or propaganda materials or any evidence of partisan activity. In one house, a volunteer named Pyotr Savelyev, a former Red Army junior sergeant from the Kursk region, found a bundle of Soviet leaflets hidden in a root cellar. The leaflets called for resistance against the German occupiers and promised that the Red Army would soon liberate the region. More damningly, they contained specific information about German troop movements that could only have come from local informants. Savelyev brought the leaflets to his German squad leader, who passed them up the chain of command. The battalion commander, a German major, ordered the village elder and 2 other men identified as possible partisan collaborators arrested. They were tied up and marched to the battalion assembly area. That evening, after the battalion had pulled back from the forest, the 3 men were interrogated. The interrogation was conducted by German security police who had accompanied the operation. The methods used were not recorded in official reports, but the screams carried across the bivouac area where the volunteers tried to sleep. By morning, one of the arrested men was dead. The other 2, broken by torture, had provided names of villagers who supported the partisans. The battalion was ordered to return to the village and arrest those named. When the arrests were made, family members wept and begged. Old women threw themselves at the feet of the German officers. Children cried for their fathers. The volunteers, forced to participate in the arrests, looked away or stared at the ground, unable to meet the eyes of the civilians. Over the following weeks, the 642 conducted numerous similar operations. They swept through forests, searched villages, set ambushes for partisan columns. The casualty rate was steady, but not catastrophic. Every week brought 1 or 2 dead, 3 or 4 wounded. The German officers rotated the companies, ensuring that no single unit bore the brunt of the danger. But there was no rotation that could relieve the psychological burden of what they were doing. The volunteers developed various methods of coping with the moral weight of their service. Some became hardened, convincing themselves that the partisans were bandits and terrorists who deserved no sympathy. These men threw themselves into anti-partisan operations with genuine enthusiasm, competing to see who could capture the most weapons or identify the most suspects. They volunteered for the most dangerous patrols, proved themselves in combat, earned decorations and promotions. Others became withdrawn and depressed, performing their duties mechanically but taking no satisfaction in success. These men obeyed orders, but did so with visible reluctance, moving slowly, avoiding eye contact with civilians, firing their weapons only when directly ordered. The German officers watched these men carefully, suspecting they might desert or defect at the first opportunity. Some did. Others simply endured day after day, caught in a nightmare they could neither escape nor fully accept. A few tried to maintain some shred of humanity by showing small kindnesses to civilians when German officers were not watching. They warned villagers before sweeps, allowed suspects to escape during searches, shared food with hungry children. These gestures were tiny acts of resistance, pathetic in their inadequacy, but psychologically necessary for the men who made them. They represented an attempt to draw a line, however faint, between collaboration and complicity in atrocity. The partisan commanders understood the psychological vulnerability of the Osttruppen and exploited it ruthlessly. Soviet propaganda leaflets specifically targeted the Eastern volunteers, calling them traitors and warning that their families would suffer for their betrayal. The leaflets also offered amnesty to those who returned to Soviet lines, though everyone understood such promises were worthless. Order 270 remained in effect. Surrender or desertion meant execution or the Gulag, regardless of circumstances. Despite this knowledge, desertions did occur. In October of 1942, an entire company of the 642, approximately 120 men, defected to the partisans during a night operation. The company had been sent to establish a blocking position in a forest sector believed to be a partisan transit route. Under cover of darkness, the volunteers simply walked away from their positions, taking their weapons and ammunition with them. By morning, they had joined a partisan brigade operating deeper in the forest. The German response was immediate and savage. The battalion commander was relieved and court-martialed for failing to prevent the desertion. The remaining companies were subjected to intensive political indoctrination and placed under even stricter German supervision. More critically, German blocking detachments were reinforced and moved closer to Osttruppen positions. The message was clear. Future desertion attempts would be met with machine gun fire from behind. The deserters themselves faced an uncertain fate. Some partisan commanders welcomed them, particularly if they brought weapons and useful intelligence. Others were deeply suspicious, fearing infiltration by German agents. The defectors from the 642 were disarmed upon joining the partisans and subjected to lengthy interrogation by SMERSH officers attached to the partisan brigade. Several were immediately executed as suspected provocateurs. The rest were grudgingly accepted but assigned to the most dangerous missions, positions where their loyalty would be tested under fire. For those who remained with the 642 and other Ostbataljonen, the desertion of an entire company confirmed their worst fears about the future. If Germany won the war, they would be discarded or enslaved. If the Soviet Union won, they would be shot as traitors. The only uncertain factor was timing. How long could they survive in this impossible position? How many more operations would they have to conduct against their own people before the war ended one way or another? The summer of 1943 brought changes that deepened this sense of impending doom. In July, the German offensive at Kursk, the last major German attack in the east, ended in catastrophic failure. The Red Army, growing stronger with each passing month, began a series of massive counter-offensives that would continue without pause until the war's end. The tide had turned. Everyone could see it. Germany was losing. For the Osttruppen, this shifting strategic balance created new calculations. Serving a losing power offered no future, but desertion had become increasingly difficult as German security tightened. Some units began experiencing a slow hemorrhage of individual desertions, men slipping away during operations and vanishing into the countryside. Others remained intact, but showed declining morale and combat effectiveness. German commanders reported instances of Osttruppen failing to engage partisans aggressively, of suspects being allowed to escape, of weapons mysteriously disappearing. In September of 1943, the German Second Army reported to higher headquarters that it had been forced to withdraw an assault battalion because of multiple mutinies and mass desertions among its eastern units. Other armies reported similar problems. The Osttruppen were becoming unreliable, their loyalty eroding as German defeats mounted. Wehrmacht planners began discussing what to do with these hundreds of thousands of armed men, whose commitment to the German cause had always been questionable and was now dissolving entirely. The solution settled upon was to transfer as many Ostbataillonen as possible away from the Eastern Front, moving them to occupation duties in France, the Netherlands, and other Western territories. There, isolated from Soviet propaganda and removed from the partisan war against their own people, the units might prove more reliable. It was a logical plan based on sound military reasoning, but it created a new problem. The Allies were planning an invasion of France. When that invasion came, the Osttruppen would face their third impossible choice: fight for Germany against the Western Allies, surrender and hope for mercy, or attempt somehow to avoid combat altogether. None of these options offered much hope for survival. The spring of 1944 saw a massive reorganization of German forces in anticipation of the Allied invasion everyone knew was coming. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, appointed to command Army Group B in northern France and the Low Countries, toured the Atlantic Wall defenses and found them woefully inadequate. He immediately began an intensive program of fortification construction, minefield laying, and obstacle emplacement. Among the resources available to him were 32 Russian battalions that had been transferred from the Eastern Front over the preceding months. These battalions were distributed among the coastal defense divisions responsible for holding the beaches where the Allies were expected to land. The 709 Static Infantry Division, defending a sector that included what would become Utah Beach, received several Ostbataillonen as integral elements of its combat strength. The 243 Static Infantry Division, positioned near the British and Canadian landing zones, was similarly reinforced with Eastern volunteers. In total, approximately 6% of the German troops defending Normandy in June of 1944 were former Soviet citizens serving in Osttruppen units. The term static division accurately described the limitations of these formations. Unlike the mobile panzer and infantry divisions held in reserve, the static divisions were essentially immobile garrison forces. They possessed minimal motor transport, relying on horses and bicycles for what little mobility they had. Their artillery was a hodgepodge of captured French, Czech, and obsolete German pieces. Most critically, their personnel consisted of overage soldiers, men recovering from wounds suffered on the Eastern Front, those deemed medically unfit for frontline service, and the Osttruppen themselves. The 642 Ostbataillon arrived in Normandy in March of 1944. After nearly 2 years of anti-partisan operations in the occupied Soviet territories, the unit had been pulled back, refitted, and shipped west. The battalion was assigned to the 716 Static Infantry Division and positioned east of the Orne River, in the sector between the river and the coastal town of Merville. The men of the 642 found themselves occupying concrete bunkers and field fortifications overlooking beaches and farmland that bore no resemblance to the forests and swamps where they had fought partisans. The volunteers greeted the transfer with mixed feelings. On one hand, they were relieved to be away from the Eastern Front. away from the partisan war, away from the constant possibility of encountering former comrades or relatives among the enemy. France seemed peaceful by comparison. A green and pleasant land where the local population, while hostile to German occupation, posed no serious military threat. On the other hand, everyone understood that the invasion would come. When it did, the Osttruppen would be in the front line, expendable troops positioned to absorb the initial assault. Rommel's fortification program transformed the Normandy coast into a complex defensive system. Concrete bunkers housing artillery pieces and machine guns commanded fields of fire across the beaches. Minefields stretched in dense belts behind the beach obstacles. Anti-tank ditches cut across likely approach routes. In the tidal zone, the Germans planted thousands of obstacles, wooden stakes and steel hedgehogs and concrete tetrahedrons, all designed to rip open the hulls of landing craft or block the passage of tanks. Behind the beaches, Rommel ordered the installation of thousands of wooden poles, each about 4 meters tall, planted in fields that might serve as landing zones for Allied gliders or paratroopers. These obstacles, which German troops called Rommel's Pagel, Rommel's asparagus, were connected by wire and topped with mines or explosive charges. East of the Orne, where the 642 was positioned, Rommel also ordered the flooding of low-lying areas by damming the Dives River. The resulting marshes and pools would prove fatal to many British paratroopers on the night of the invasion. The Osttruppen, assigned to coastal defense, worked alongside German engineers on these fortifications. They laid mines, strung wire, dug trenches, poured concrete. The work was hard but not dangerous, infinitely preferable to combat. The volunteers received regular rations, better than what they had known in anti-partisan operations, and far better than the starvation diet of the POW camps. Some began to hope that perhaps they might survive the war after all. If the invasion could be defeated at the beaches, if the Atlantic Wall proved as impregnable as German propaganda claimed, then maybe they would live to see peace. But veterans among the volunteers knew better. They had seen what Allied air power could do. Even in Normandy, far from the main strategic bombing campaign against Germany, Allied aircraft appeared overhead daily. Fighters strafed German convoys on the roads. Medium bombers struck bridges and rail yards. The Allies clearly possessed overwhelming superiority in the air. When the invasion came, that superiority would be decisive. The concrete bunkers might survive the bombardment. The men inside them would not. The German command structure reflected deep uncertainty about how to fight the coming invasion. Rommel believed the battle had to be won on the beaches in the first hours, before the Allies could establish a foothold. He wanted the panzer divisions positioned close to the coast, ready for immediate counterattack. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the west, disagreed. He wanted to hold the armor in reserve, away from Allied naval gunfire, and use it for a massive counterstroke after the invasion point was clearly identified. The dispute remained unresolved as June approached, with the result that the panzer divisions were scattered, too far from the coast to intervene quickly, but too close to escape Allied air attack. For the Osttruppen in their bunkers and trenches, these high-level strategic debates were irrelevant. They knew only that they were positioned directly in the path of the invasion, that they had been given obsolete weapons and inadequate ammunition, and that the German officers commanding them had made clear they were expendable. Some of the volunteers considered desertion, but where would they go? They spoke no French, wore German uniforms, and would be shot as spies if caught by the French resistance. Their only hope was to survive the invasion and surrender to the Allies as quickly as possible. The invasion began in darkness in the early hours of June 6, 1944. Starting at midnight, Allied paratroopers and glider-borne infantry began landing throughout Normandy. The British 6th Airborne Division, tasked with securing the eastern flank of the invasion, dropped thousands of men into the sector held by the 716 Static Infantry Division. Many of these paratroopers came down in the flooded areas Rommel had created, drowning in the darkness, weighed down by their equipment. Others landed in the fields sown with Rommel's asparagus, where they fought sharp, confused actions against German and Osttruppen defenders. The 642 Ostbattalion's first contact with Allied forces came around 0200 hours, when British paratroopers of the 9th Parachute Battalion began assembling near the battery position at Merville. The battery, garrisoned by a section from the 736 Grenadier Regiment and supported by elements of the 642, consisted of 4 concrete casemates housing artillery pieces. The guns threatened Sword Beach, one of the main British landing zones, and their elimination was considered essential. The 9th Parachute Battalion had been badly scattered during its drop. Lieutenant Colonel Terence Otway, the battalion commander, could muster only 150 men out of the 600 who had jumped. Most of his heavy weapons and equipment had been lost. Nevertheless, he decided to proceed with the assault on the battery. The attack began shortly after 0430 hours with a diversionary bombing raid that largely missed the target. Then the paratroopers stormed the position. The defenders, a mix of German artillery crews and Osttruppen infantry, fought back with unexpected determination. Machine guns raked the advancing British troops. Rifle fire crackled from the trenches surrounding the casemates. For 20 minutes, savage close-quarters combat raged in the darkness. The paratroopers used grenades and bayonets, fighting their way into the casemates one by one. The defenders, caught by surprise and outnumbered, gradually fell back or surrendered. When the position was secured, the British discovered that the artillery pieces were not the 150mm guns they had expected, but obsolete 100mm howitzers of limited range. Nevertheless, the guns were spiked and the position held until relieved later in the day. The cost had been heavy. The 9th Parachute Battalion suffered 75 casualties in the assault. The defenders lost approximately 50 men killed or wounded, with another 30 taken prisoner. Among the prisoners were a dozen Osttruppen from the 642, captured in their bunkers before they fully understood what was happening. As dawn broke over Normandy, the naval bombardment began. Hundreds of Allied warships, from battleships to destroyers, opened fire on the beach defenses. The shelling was unlike anything the Osttruppen had experienced in 2 years of war. On the Eastern Front, artillery barrages had been intense but localized. This was different. The naval guns were enormous, firing shells that weighed hundreds of kilograms. The explosions were catastrophic, obliterating bunkers and trenches, burying men alive under tons of concrete and earth. Along the coast east of the Orne, where elements of the 642 were positioned, the bombardment was particularly intense. British battleships and cruisers systematically worked over the defensive positions, firing salvo after salvo into the bunker line. The Osttruppen, huddled in whatever cover they could find, could do nothing but endure. Some bunkers took direct hits and collapsed. Others survived, but were cut off from communication with higher headquarters. The defenders were blind, isolated, terrified. When the landing craft began approaching the beaches around 0730 hours, the defensive fire from the surviving positions was sporadic and ineffective. Many gun crews had been killed or stunned by the bombardment. Others had abandoned their positions and fled inland. The Osttruppen, watching the armada of landing craft approaching through the smoke and dust, understood that resistance was futile. Some tried to fight, firing their rifles and machine guns at the landing craft. Others immediately attempted to surrender, running toward the beaches with hands raised. The Allied soldiers storming ashore that morning encountered a confusing tactical situation, made more confusing by the presence of Osttruppen. British and Canadian troops advancing from Sword and Juno beaches found themselves facing defenders who shouted in Russian, who wore German uniforms but had Asian features, who sometimes fought with determination and sometimes surrendered en masse. The invaders had been briefed that they might encounter foreign volunteers in German service, but the reality was still jarring. A British company commander landing on Sword Beach later recorded his impressions of the first prisoners taken that morning. Among them were men from the 642, captured as they attempted to withdraw from their coastal positions. The officer noted that they were obviously not German, that they seemed eager to surrender, and that they kept repeating the word Ruski in an apparent attempt to identify themselves as Soviet citizens. The British soldiers, uncertain what to do with these unexpected prisoners, simply herded them to the rear with the captured Germans. For the Osttruppen, surrender brought relief, followed by new anxiety. They were alive. They had survived the bombardment and the initial assault. But what would happen to them now? Would the British hand them over to Soviet forces? Would they be treated as prisoners of war or as war criminals? Would they ever see their families again? These questions had no answers. The prisoners could only wait and hope. As the day wore on, the pattern repeated itself across the invasion front. Osttruppen units fought with varying degrees of effectiveness, then surrendered or withdrew as their positions became untenable. The 709 Static Infantry Division, defending Utah Beach, included several eastern battalions. These units were quickly overwhelmed by the American assault. Some Osttruppen fought briefly, then surrendered. Others fled inland, hoping to evade capture by either side. The 243 Static Infantry Division, facing British and Canadian forces at Gold Beach, experienced similar rapid disintegration. One of its Ostbataljonen, the 632, was effectively destroyed in the first day of fighting. Another, the 635, managed a more organized withdrawal but lost most of its heavy weapons and equipment. By nightfall on June 6th, the Wehrmacht had lost effective control of most of its Osttruppen formations in Normandy. They had scattered into the countryside, surrendered, or been annihilated. The German response to the invasion was hampered by the divided command structure and the destruction of communications by Allied air attack. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armor formation close enough to the beaches to intervene on the first day, attempted a counterattack toward the sea between Sword and Juno beaches. The attack made some progress but was stopped by Allied naval gunfire and the arrival of British armor from the beaches. By evening, the 21st Panzer had withdrawn, having failed to throw the Allies back into the sea. For the remnants of Osttruppen units like the 642, the days following the invasion were a chaos of retreat and dissolution. Cut off from their German officers, lacking clear orders, unfamiliar with the terrain, the volunteers wandered through the Norman countryside, trying to avoid combat. Some attempted to surrender to Allied forces. Others hid in barns and forests, hoping to wait out the battle. A few tried to organize resistance, gathering weapons and setting up defensive positions, but these efforts were quickly overwhelmed by Allied advances. In the Cottontown Peninsula, where the American forces drove north towards Cherbourg, the situation for the Osttruppen became particularly desperate. The 709 Static Infantry Division, responsible for defending the peninsula, was cut off and surrounded. Its Osttruppen components, already demoralized and poorly equipped, began surrendering in large groups. By the time Cherbourg fell on June 26th, after 3 weeks of fighting, the division had been effectively destroyed. Thousands of its Osttruppen were in Allied captivity. The fate of these prisoners remained uncertain for weeks. Allied policy regarding Soviet citizens in German uniform had not been clearly established. Some were held in standard POW camps alongside captured German soldiers. Others were segregated into separate compounds while higher authorities decided what to do with them. The volunteers themselves understood that their situation was precarious. They had fought against the Allies. They had worn German uniforms. They faced possible prosecution as traitors or war criminals. Unknown to them, their fate was already being decided at levels far above the tactical situation in Normandy. At the Tehran Conference in November of 1943, and again at Yalta in February of 1945, the Allied leaders would agree to the forced repatriation of all Soviet citizens found in Western Europe, regardless of their personal wishes or circumstances. This agreement, made in the name of Allied unity and post-war cooperation, would seal the doom of the Osttruppen. Those who had survived the invasion, who had endured captivity, who had hoped against hope that somehow they might escape Stalin's vengeance, would be handed over to Soviet authorities for trial and punishment. But in late June of 1944, as the Battle of Normandy ground on and the Allied breakout prepared to begin, these future horrors remained unknown. The Osttruppen sat in their prison camps, grateful to be alive, uncertain of what tomorrow would bring, haunted by everything they had done and everything that had been done to them. While the Osttruppen in Normandy faced the Allied invasion and its aftermath, events on the Eastern Front were moving toward a climax that would transform the nature of Soviet collaboration with Germany. By the autumn of 1944, the Red Army had driven German forces out of most of the occupied Soviet territories. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat across a 1,000-mile front, falling back toward the borders of the Reich itself. In this desperate situation, Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, finally succeeded in convincing Adolf Hitler to authorize what Andrey Vlasov had been seeking for more than 2 years, the formation of genuine Russian Liberation Army divisions under Russian command. Hitler's decision represented a complete reversal of his previous position. For years, he had insisted that Slavic peoples were racially inferior and could never be trusted with real military power. He had permitted the use of Osttruppen only as auxiliaries and had consistently blocked Vlasov's attempts to create an independent Russian army. But by September of 1944, ideology had to bow to military necessity. The Eastern Front was collapsing. German manpower reserves were exhausted. The hundreds of thousands of former Soviet citizens already in German service represented a resource that could no longer be wasted. The formal announcement came on November 14, 1944, in Prague. Vlasov appeared before a carefully staged assembly of Russian émigrés, German officials, and representatives of the Osttruppen to read aloud the Prague Manifesto. This document, which Vlasov and his political advisors had labored over for months, outlined the goals and principles of what was now to be called the Committee for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia, abbreviated in Russian as KONAR. The manifesto contained 14 points that spelled out the vision of a post-Stalin Russia. It called for the overthrow of Bolshevism and the destruction of Stalin's dictatorship. It promised the establishment of democratic governance, respect for private property, and the rights of all peoples within Russia to self-determination. It pledged to end the collective farm system and restore land to the peasants. It guaranteed freedom of religion, speech, and assembly. In short, it promised everything that the Soviet system denied. What the manifesto did not contain was any explicit endorsement of Nazi racial theories or German war aims. Vlasov and his advisors had successfully resisted German pressure to include anti-Semitic rhetoric, though they were forced to accept language criticizing the Western Allies as plutocracies allied with Stalin in the conquest of Europe. This compromise reflected the impossible position Vlasov occupied. He needed German support to create his army, but he also needed to maintain credibility with potential Russian recruits who would never fight for explicit Nazi goals. The creation of Korner was accompanied by authorization to form multiple divisions of the Russian Liberation Army, the ROA. German officials spoke optimistically about raising 10 divisions, a force of perhaps 200,000 men. In reality, the deteriorating military situation and Germany's collapsing infrastructure made such ambitious plans impossible. By the time Germany surrendered in May of 1945, only one division had been fully organized and equipped. This was the 1st Infantry Division of the ROA, known also as the 600th German Infantry Division in Wehrmacht records. Its formation began in December of 1944 at the training grounds at Münzingen in southwestern Germany. The division was organized along standard German infantry lines with 3 regiments plus supporting artillery, engineers, and service units. Its authorized strength was approximately 20,000 men. Command of the 1st Division went to Major General Sergei Kuzmich Bunyachenko, a former Red Army officer who had been captured early in the war and had spent 3 years working to create effective Russian units within the German military structure. Bunyachenko was 42 years old, a career soldier with extensive combat experience. He was also a pragmatist who understood that Germany was losing the war and that the ROA's only chance for survival lay in eventually switching sides or negotiating a separate surrender to the Western Allies. The soldiers of the 1st Division came from multiple sources. Some were veterans of the Ostbataillonen, men who had served in anti-partisan operations or coastal defense, and who now saw an opportunity to join a formation that was at least nominally Russian rather than German. Others were former Hiwis, auxiliaries who had performed rear echelon duties and who volunteered for combat service in the ROA. Still others were Ostarbeiter, Eastern workers who had been deported to Germany for forced labor and who saw military service as preferable to factory slavery. The division was equipped with German weapons and vehicles, though much of the equipment was obsolete or worn out. The standard rifle was the Karabiner 98, the bolt-action weapon that had served the German army since before the First World War. Machine guns were a mix of MG-34s and 42s. Artillery consisted of light field pieces, mostly 75mm guns. The division had minimal armor support, a few assault guns, and armored cars. For transportation, it relied on a hodgepodge of trucks, horse-drawn wagons, and requisitioned civilian vehicles. Training proceeded slowly through the winter of 1944 and into early 1945. The division was assembled from men who had been scattered across occupied Europe, speaking different languages, following different military traditions. Welding them into an effective combat formation required time that Germany no longer possessed. Nevertheless, by February of 1945, Bunyachenko reported the division ready for action. The test came on February 11th, when the 1st Division was ordered to the Oder River front, where the Red Army was preparing its final offensive toward Berlin. The division took up positions near the towns of Neulewin and Kerstenbruch, facing elements of the Soviet 230th Infantry Division. For the men of the ROA, this was the moment they had simultaneously dreaded and anticipated. They were finally going into action against the Red Army, fighting under their own flag for their own cause, rather than as German auxiliaries. The battle lasted 3 days. The ROA troops fought with determination that surprised their German observers. They repulsed Soviet probing attacks, conducted local counterattacks to straighten their lines, and even captured a camouflaged Soviet anti-tank battery that had been positioned to ambush German armor. During the fighting, ROA soldiers called out to their Soviet opponents, trying to convince them to defect. Soviet political officers responded by intensifying their own propaganda, shouting that the ROA were traitors who would be shown no mercy. Despite their efforts, the 1st Division could not hold against the overwhelming Soviet superiority in numbers and firepower. On February 14th, Bunyachenko requested permission to withdraw. The division pulled back in reasonable order, having suffered moderate casualties, but having proven that it could fight effectively. More importantly, the battle demonstrated that ROA soldiers would engage Soviet forces, that they were not simply waiting for an opportunity to defect en masse, but the Battle of the Oder also revealed the fundamental problem facing the ROA. Even if every Osttruppe in German service had been organized into the planned 10 divisions, even if those divisions had been fully equipped with modern weapons, they would still have been vastly outnumbered by the Red Army. By February of 1945, the Soviet Union was fielding more than 500 divisions on the Eastern Front alone. The idea that a Russian Liberation Army could defeat the Red Army was fantasy. At best, the ROA might serve as a bargaining chip in negotiations. At worst, it was a final gesture of defiance before inevitable destruction. Andrey Vlasov understood this reality. In the weeks following the Oder battle, he began seriously exploring the possibility of switching sides, of offering the ROA's services to the Western Allies against Germany. The logic was straightforward. Germany was finished. The ROA had no future as a German auxiliary force. But perhaps the Americans and British could be convinced that an armed Russian anti-communist movement would be useful in the inevitable post-war confrontation with Stalin. It was a desperate gamble, but Vlasov saw no alternative. Bunyachenko shared this view and acted on it more aggressively than Vlasov was willing to publicly acknowledge. In March of 1945, the 1st Division was withdrawn from the Oder front and moved south into Bohemia. Officially, this was a tactical redeployment. In reality, Bunyachenko was positioning his division to escape the approaching Red Army and to make contact with American forces advancing from the west. German commanders quickly realized what Bunyachenko was doing. Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, commanding Army Group Center, sent increasingly urgent and threatening messages demanding that the ROA division return to German control and follow German orders. Bunyachenko ignored these demands. When Schörner threatened to use force, Bunyachenko responded that his division would fight any German units that attempted to interfere with its movements. Vlasov found himself caught between his nominal German superiors and his most capable subordinate. In a meeting with Schörner in late March, Vlasov publicly reprimanded Bunyachenko and assured the German Field Marshal that the ROA remained loyal to the common struggle against Bolshevism. But privately, when he met with Bunyachenko afterward, Vlasov told him to continue acting independently. Vlasov understood that Bunyachenko's insubordination represented the ROA's best chance for survival. The other 2 divisions that were supposed to form the core of the ROA never reached operational status. The 2nd Division, the 650th German Infantry, began forming at a camp at Heuberg, but was still incomplete when events overtook it. The division left its training area in April and marched south, absorbing thousands of Ostarbeiter and former Hiwis who flocked to join what they hoped might be a path to salvation. By the time it reached Austria, the 2nd Division had swollen to nearly twice its authorized strength, a disorganized mass of desperate men looking for any alternative to capture by the Soviets. The 3rd Division, designated the 700th German Infantry, barely existed beyond a headquarters staff and some preliminary unit formations. The rapid collapse of German authority in the spring of 1945 prevented its completion. The various other Russian and Cossack formations that had nominally agreed to join the ROA, including the 15th SS Cossack Cavalry Corps under German General Helmuth von Panwitz, never actually integrated with Vlasov's command structure. Communication and coordination broke down as the Reich disintegrated. By late April of 1945, the military situation had become apocalyptic. The Red Army was fighting in the streets of Berlin. British and American forces were racing across Germany from the west. The Wehrmacht was dissolving, with entire units surrendering or simply disbanding. In this chaos, the 1st Division of the ROA, still relatively intact under Bunyachenko's command, found itself in Bohemia between the German garrison forces trying to maintain order and Czech resistance fighters preparing to rise against their occupiers. Vlasov, traveling with a small headquarters staff, was trying desperately to make contact with American commanders. He sent delegations under flags of truce, carrying letters explaining the ROA's position and requesting asylum for his soldiers. The Americans were polite but non-committal. They had been briefed about the ROA but had received no clear guidance on how to handle Russian defectors from German service. More critically, they were aware of agreements made between Allied leaders regarding the repatriation of Soviet citizens. Taking in the ROA might create serious diplomatic complications with Moscow. As Vlasov negotiated with the Americans, events in Prague moved beyond anyone's control. The Czech resistance, emboldened by news of Germany's impending surrender, began planning an uprising to liberate their capital before the Red Army arrived. They looked for allies wherever they could find them. When they learned that a 20,000-man Russian division, nominally in German service but commanded by Russian officers, was positioned nearby, they saw an opportunity. Messengers were sent to Bunyachenko requesting the ROA's assistance in liberating Prague. The request placed Bunyachenko in an impossible position. Helping the Czechs meant openly breaking with Germany and engaging in combat against German forces. It also meant taking sides in what was essentially a race between the Western Allies and the Red Army to control post-war Central Europe. If the Americans reached Prague first, the ROA's intervention might be viewed favorably. If the Soviets arrived first, every ROA soldier who participated would face certain execution as a traitor. Vlasov, when informed of the Czech request, advised against intervention. He believed the ROA should concentrate its forces, avoid combat with anyone, and focus entirely on negotiating surrender to the Americans. Bunyachenko disagreed. He argued that the ROA needed to demonstrate its value to the Western Allies, that sitting passively while Prague rose against the Germans would be seen as cowardice. The two men met in a tense conference with the division's senior officers to discuss the matter. The meeting ended with Vlasov walking out. He told Bunyachenko that if the general's orders were no longer binding, if the division was going to act independently regardless of his wishes, then he had no role to play. It was a dramatic gesture, but also a calculated one. Vlasov was giving Bunyachenko permission to do what he thought necessary while maintaining his own deniability with the Germans. If the gamble succeeded, Vlasov could claim credit. If it failed, he could claim he had opposed it. Bunyachenko made his decision. The 1st Division would march to Prague and join the Czech uprising. It was the last throw of the dice, the final desperate attempt to find a place in the post-war world. The consequences would be catastrophic. The Prague uprising began spontaneously on the morning of May 5, 1945. Czech resistance fighters seized key buildings in the city center, raised the Czechoslovak flag over government offices, and called on the population to rise against the German occupation. Within hours, barricades appeared in the streets. Czech police and firefighters joined the insurgents. Radio stations broadcast appeals for help, begging the approaching Allied armies to reach Prague before the Germans could crush the rebellion. The German garrison in Prague, numbering approximately 40,000 troops, was under orders to hold the city at all costs. Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, commanding Army Group Center, still refused to accept that the war was lost. His forces included elements of several SS divisions, Wehrmacht security units, and various support formations. These troops were well armed and experienced, far stronger than the poorly equipped Czech insurgents. If the Germans concentrated their forces, they could retake the city within days. But the Germans also faced problems. Their supply lines were cut. The Red Army was approaching from the east. American forces under General George Patton had reached Pilsen, only about 80 kilometers southwest of Prague. German units were deserting or attempting to flee westward to surrender to the Americans rather than face Soviet captivity. The situation was fluid and chaotic, with no one fully in control. Into this volatile situation marched the 1st Division of the Russian Liberation Army. Bunyachenko's forces had been positioned near the town of Beroun, about 30 kilometers southwest of Prague, when news of the uprising reached them. The Czech resistance group known as Bartosz had been in contact with ROA officers for several days, discussing the possibility of cooperation. Now, with the uprising underway, the Czechs sent urgent messages begging the Russians to intervene. Bunyachenko assembled his senior officers on the evening of May 5th to make the final decision. The arguments for and against intervention were presented. Those opposed warned that fighting the Germans would bring immediate retaliation, that the ROA would be caught between German forces and the approaching Red Army, that Vlasov had explicitly advised against this course of action. Those in favor argued that the ROA needed to demonstrate its value, that helping to liberate Prague might convince the Americans to grant asylum, that passive waiting had no future. The division's political officer, a former Red Army major named Alexei Zaitsev, made perhaps the most persuasive argument. He pointed out that the men of the 1st Division were doomed regardless of what they did. If they surrendered to the Soviets, they would be shot as traitors. If they surrendered to the Americans, they would likely be handed over to the Soviets under repatriation agreements. Their only hope was to make themselves so valuable to the Western allies that the Americans would refuse to give them up. Liberating Prague from the Germans might provide that value. Bunyachenko gave the order to march. Early on the morning of May 6th, the 1st Division moved toward Prague in battalion columns. They advanced through territory still nominally under German control, their progress watched nervously by Wehrmacht units that were unsure whether to treat the Russians as allies or enemies. German officers attempted to contact Bunyachenko by radio, demanding to know his intentions. He ignored them. The division reached the southwestern outskirts of Prague around noon on May 6th. Czech civilians greeted them with bewilderment and hope. The insurgents were delighted, but also wary. These were Russian soldiers in German uniforms, carrying German weapons, flying a Russian tricolor flag that most Czechs did not recognize. Were they liberators or another occupying force? The ROA officers did their best to explain who they were and why they had come, but language barriers and the general confusion made communication difficult. The first combat between the ROA and German forces began that afternoon, when a company of the 1st Division encountered an SS unit attempting to re-enter the city center from the west. The two forces opened fire almost simultaneously. The engagement was sharp but brief. The SS troops, outnumbered and surprised, withdrew after taking casualties. The ROA soldiers, many of whom had fought partisans for years but had never engaged German forces, were shocked by what they had done. They had crossed a line. There was no going back now. Over the next 36 hours, the 1st Division fought a confused urban battle against various German units attempting to suppress the uprising. The ROA soldiers helped Czech insurgents defend barricades, provided covering fire during attacks on German strongpoints, and used their artillery to bombard German assembly areas. The fighting was intense in places, with house-to-house combat in several districts. German forces, though better equipped, were demoralized and increasingly focused on escaping to the west rather than holding Prague. The military impact of the ROA's intervention was significant but not decisive. The division's 20,000 men roughly equaled the number of Czech insurgents, doubling the rebel forces in the city. More importantly, the ROA brought heavy weapons that the Czechs lacked. The division's artillery proved particularly valuable, breaking up German counterattacks before they could develop momentum. By the evening of May 7th, the Germans had largely withdrawn from the city center, concentrating their remaining forces in defensive positions on the outskirts. But even as the ROA fought alongside the Czech resistance, a darker drama was unfolding. Communist partisans, who formed a significant faction within the resistance movement, viewed the ROA soldiers not as liberators, but as traitors and collaborators who deserved death. These partisans, many of whom had been in contact with Soviet intelligence throughout the war, began identifying and arresting ROA soldiers wherever they could find them isolated from their units. The first arrests occurred on the evening of May 6th. Several ROA soldiers who had become separated from their companies during the fighting were detained by Czech partisan units. When the men identified themselves as members of the Russian Liberation Army, they were handed over to Soviet liaison officers who had been operating with the partisan groups. These officers were from Smersh, the Soviet counterintelligence agency tasked with hunting down collaborators and traitors. The Smersh officers immediately executed some of the captured ROA soldiers. Others were held for interrogation. Word of these executions spread quickly through the 1st Division. The men realized that they were not fighting simply to liberate Prague, but also to avoid being handed over to the Soviets by the very people they were helping. The irony was bitter. They had come to aid the Czech uprising, but elements of that uprising intended to deliver them to their executioners. By May 7th, Bunyachenko understood that the situation was untenable. The Red Army was approaching Prague from the east, with Soviet tank columns now only kilometers from the city limits. General Patton, despite pleas from Czech resistance leaders, had halted at Pilsen under orders from Supreme Allied Headquarters not to advance beyond the agreed-upon demarcation line with Soviet forces. There would be no American liberation of Prague. The Soviets would arrive within hours. Bunyachenko called a meeting of his senior officers. The conclusion was unanimous. The division had to withdraw immediately, moving west toward American lines before the Soviet encirclement was complete. Any delay meant certain capture and death. At 11 in the evening on May 7th, Bunyachenko issued orders for a general withdrawal. The 1st Division would disengage from combat with the Germans and march west through the night. The Czech resistance leaders, when informed of the ROA's decision, reacted with shock and anger. The Russians were abandoning them at the critical moment, leaving them to face both the remaining German forces and the approaching Red Army. Some accused Bunyachenko of cowardice and betrayal. Others understood the impossible position the ROA occupied. A few Czech officers helped organize the withdrawal, providing guides and information about routes west. The withdrawal began shortly after midnight on May 8th. The division moved in regimental columns, with advance guards clearing the route and rear guards fighting delaying actions against pursuing forces. The march was conducted in near darkness, with minimal use of vehicle lights to avoid attracting attention. German units, also fleeing westward, sometimes found themselves moving parallel to ROA columns. In the chaos, there were occasional friendly exchanges between forces that hours earlier had been shooting at each other. As the 1st Division marched west, Andrey Vlasov, traveling with a small headquarters group, was attempting to reach American lines separately. He had spent the previous days trying to negotiate asylum for his forces, meeting with American intelligence officers and trying to convince them that the ROA could be useful in the coming confrontation with Stalin. The Americans were sympathetic, but constrained by orders from higher headquarters. They could accept individual defectors, but not entire military formations. On May 10th, Vlasov and his staff reached a small town in western Bohemia, where American forces were concentrated. He surrendered himself to an American captain, expecting to be taken into protective custody. The Americans were courteous, but clearly uncertain what to do with him. They provided food and temporary quarters while they contacted higher headquarters for instructions. 2 days later, on May 12th, Vlasov's situation changed catastrophically. He was being driven to another location for further discussions with American officers when his vehicle convoy was intercepted by Soviet troops. The Soviets, operating well beyond the agreed demarcation line, had been actively searching for Vlasov. They surrounded the American vehicles and demanded that Vlasov be turned over to them. The American escort, outnumbered and surprised, did not resist. They watched as Soviet soldiers pulled Vlasov from his vehicle and placed him under arrest. Vlasov, understanding what awaited him, remained calm. He had known this moment would come eventually. The only question had been when. Now he had his answer. The other senior ROA officers were captured over the following days. Bunyachenko, attempting to lead the 1st Division to safety, found all routes west blocked by American forces who had been ordered not to allow large armed Soviet formations to cross into the American zone. Trapped between the Americans, who would not accept them, and the Soviets who were hunting them, the division disintegrated. Some soldiers discarded their uniforms and tried to disappear into the civilian population. Others surrendered to the Americans, hoping somehow to avoid repatriation. Bunyachenko himself was captured by Soviet forces on May 14th. The rank-and-file soldiers of the ROA faced varying fates, depending on where and when they were captured. Those taken by Soviet forces in Czechoslovakia were immediately sent to filtration camps, prison facilities, where NKVD and SMERSH officers interrogated repatriated soldiers to identify collaborators and traitors. The interrogations were brutal, beatings were routine, confessions were extracted through torture. Most were sentenced to 25 years in labor camps. Many were simply shot. Those ROA soldiers who surrendered to American or British forces were held in POW compounds while Allied authorities decided what to do with them. The decision had already been made at the highest levels. Under agreements reached at the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, all Soviet citizens found in Western Europe were to be repatriated to the Soviet Union, regardless of their personal wishes. This included Osttruppen, ROA soldiers, Ostarbeiter, and anyone else who held Soviet citizenship. The implementation of this policy would take months and would be characterized by scenes of horror that traumatized the Allied soldiers forced to carry it out. But in May of 1945, as Germany surrendered and the war in Europe officially ended, these future atrocities remained in the future. For now, the Osttruppen and their families could only wait in the camps, hoping against all evidence that somehow they might be spared. Vlasov spent the year following his capture in Lubyanka prison in Moscow. He was interrogated repeatedly by Viktor Abakumov, the head of SMERSH, who had personally overseen the hunt for the ROA leadership. The interrogations focused on obtaining a full confession of treason and on identifying everyone who had collaborated with the German military or intelligence services. Vlasov, subjected to torture and psychological pressure, eventually provided much of what his interrogators wanted. In the summer of 1946, Vlasov and 11 other senior ROA officers were brought to trial before a military tribunal. The trial was held in secret, with no defense attorneys and no possibility of appeal. The verdict was predetermined. On August 1, 1946, all 12 defendants were sentenced to death by hanging for treason against the Soviet state. The executions were carried out that same day in the courtyard of Butyrka prison in Moscow. Vlasov and his fellow officers were hanged without ceremony or publicity. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves. For decades, The Soviet government would deny that the trial had even occurred. Only after the collapse of the Soviet Union would the full details become public. The men who had led the Russian Liberation Army, who had believed they were fighting for a free Russia, ended their lives on Soviet gallows, condemned as the traitors Stalin had always claimed them to be. The full scope of the Osttruppen tragedy can only be understood through examination of the statistical evidence, the archival records that document both the scale of collaboration and the scale of subsequent retribution. These numbers tell a story of desperation, survival, and ultimately of a vengeance so thorough that it consumed not only the collaborators themselves, but the memory of their choices. The mortality in German prisoner of war camps during the first 18 months of the Eastern Campaign remains one of the war's most devastating statistics. Of the 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by German forces during the entire war, approximately 3.3 million died in captivity, a death rate of 57%. This compares to a mortality rate of 3.6% for British and American prisoners held by Germany. The difference reflects not merely the hardships of war, but a deliberate policy of extermination through starvation and neglect. The peak of this mortality occurred in the winter of 1941 to 42. In October of 1941 alone, approximately 5,000 Soviet prisoners died every day from starvation, disease, and exposure. By February of 1942, 2 million of the 3.3 million prisoners captured up to that point were dead. This represented one of the highest sustained death rates for any mass atrocity in human history, a rate of killing that approached and sometimes exceeded that achieved in the Nazi extermination camps. It was from this population of the dying that the Germans recruited their Osttruppen. The total number of former Soviet citizens who served in some capacity with German forces is difficult to establish with precision. Soviet records were incomplete or deliberately falsified. German records were lost or destroyed in the chaos of defeat. Post-war scholarship, drawing on multiple archives and sources, suggests that approximately 1 million men served as Osttruppen in various capacities between 1942 and 1945. This million can be broken down into several categories. The Hilfswillige, the voluntary helpers or Hiwis, numbered in the hundreds of thousands. These were auxiliaries attached to German divisions, performing non-combat duties but wearing German uniforms and subject to German military discipline. The Ostbataillonen, organized battalion-sized units of Eastern volunteers, comprised approximately 175,000 men organized into roughly 250 battalions. The Ostlegionen, larger formations organized along ethnic lines, added tens of thousands more. Finally, the Russian Liberation Army, in its various incarnations, reached a peak strength of approximately 50,000 men in early 1945. Not all of these men survived to face repatriation. Casualties in anti-partisan operations, losses during the Normandy fighting, deaths from disease and accidents, and executions for desertion or insubordination reduced the total significantly. By the war's end in May of 1945, perhaps 700,000 to 800,000 former Osttruppen were alive in various locations across Europe, from POW camps in Britain and America to displaced person centers in Germany to prisons in the Soviet Union itself. The fate of these survivors was determined by agreements reached between the Allied powers during the final year of the war. At the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union agreed that all Soviet citizens found in Allied-controlled areas would be repatriated to the Soviet Union regardless of their personal wishes. This agreement, which came to be implemented under the codename Operation Kielhaul, sealed the doom of the Osttruppen. The forced repatriation began in the spring of 1945 and continued into 1947. Allied soldiers were ordered to round up Soviet citizens in displaced persons camps, POW compounds, and refugee centers and turn them over to Soviet authorities. The scenes that resulted traumatized many of those who carried out these orders. The repatriates understood what awaited them in the Soviet Union. Some committed suicide rather than board the trains and ships that would take them east. Others resisted violently, requiring the use of force to compel compliance. British historian Nikolai Tolstoy documented numerous instances of repatriates attempting to kill themselves or each other to avoid return to Soviet custody. Men bit into each other's jugular veins. They impaled themselves on broken glass. They jumped from moving trains. Mothers holding infants leaped to their deaths rather than face Stalin's justice. Allied soldiers, ordered to use whatever means necessary to prevent such desperate acts, sometimes resorted to sedating entire groups with barbiturates administered in food or drink. The total number subjected to forced repatriation exceeded 2 million Soviet citizens, including Osttruppen, Ostarbeiter forced laborers, and various other categories of Soviet nationals found in the West. The majority were returned between May and September of 1945. Later repatriations were more selective, focusing on those who had demonstrably served in German military or police units. But the fundamental policy remained unchanged. Soviet citizenship meant return to Soviet control. Those returned to the Soviet Union faced a systematic process of filtration designed to identify collaborators and extract confessions. The NKVD and SMERSH, the Soviet counterintelligence agencies, established more than 100 filtration camps to process the returnees. Approximately 1.8 million repatriated soldiers passed through these camps between 1945 and 1946. The filtration process involved extensive interrogation. Officers questioned each returnee about the circumstances of his capture, his activities while in German custody, and any contact he might have had with German intelligence or military organizations. Cross-referencing with unit records, witness testimonies, and information extracted from other prisoners allowed the interrogators to identify inconsistencies and lies. Those found to have served in Osttruppen units or to have otherwise collaborated with the Germans faced immediate arrest. The statistics on the outcomes of filtration vary depending on the source. Soviet official figures, released decades later, claimed that by 1946, approximately 80% of civilians and 20% of POWs were freed after filtration. 5% of civilians and 43% of POWs were redrafted into the Red Army. 10% of civilians and 22% of POWs were sent to labor battalions for reconstruction work. 2% of civilians and 15% of POWs, approximately 226,000 individuals, were sentenced to terms in the Gulag labor camp system. Western historians have argued that these figures significantly understate the true scale of punishment. Many repatriates were sentenced to penal military battalions that had survival rates little better than the Gulag. Others were simply executed without trial, particularly in the immediate aftermath of repatriation, when SMERSH had broad authority to dispense summary justice. The true number who died as a direct result of repatriation, whether through execution, labor camp mortality, or suicide, will never be known with certainty, but almost certainly exceeded several 100,000. The military and strategic significance of the Osttruppen can be assessed from multiple perspectives. From a purely military standpoint, their contribution to the German war effort was marginal. The Eastern battalions freed German troops for frontline duty and provided local knowledge useful in anti-partisan operations. But they were never reliable enough to be used in major combat operations, and their tendency to desert or defect made them a security liability. The combat performance of the ROA 1st Division at the Oder River and in Prague demonstrated that properly led and motivated Osttruppen could fight effectively, but by the time the ROA was formed, Germany's military situation was hopeless regardless. The political significance of the Osttruppen phenomenon was far greater than its military impact. The fact that approximately 1 million Soviet citizens chose to serve Germany, even under the desperate circumstances of POW camp starvation, revealed a depth of alienation from Stalin's regime that Soviet propaganda could not explain away. This massive collaboration undermined the Soviet narrative of the Great Patriotic War as a unified national struggle against fascist aggression. It suggested instead that millions of Soviet citizens saw German occupation, however brutal, as potentially preferable to continued communist rule. Stalin's response to this threat to the regime's legitimacy was characteristically ruthless. Order 270 and subsequent directives established the principle that any Soviet citizen who fell into German hands, regardless of circumstances, was guilty of treason. The mass repatriation and punishment of the Osttruppen served multiple purposes. It eliminated a population that had demonstrated active disloyalty. It terrorized any others who might have harbored anti-Soviet sentiments. Most importantly, it allowed Stalin to control the narrative of the war by removing those whose stories contradicted official history. The moral complexity of the Osttruppen case resists simple judgment. The volunteers made choices that led them to fight against their own countrymen, to participate in anti-partisan operations that sometimes targeted civilians, and in some documented cases, to commit atrocities. These facts are inescapable. Yet the context in which these choices were made cannot be ignored. The alternative to volunteering was often death by starvation in POW camps, where thousands died daily. The regime they were fighting against was Stalin's Soviet Union, which had murdered millions of its own citizens through collectivization, purges, and terror. Some Osttruppen were motivated by genuine anti-communist ideology, by nationalist aspirations for Ukrainian or Baltic or Caucasian independence, or by the desire to fight a regime that had destroyed their families. Others simply wanted to survive and made whatever choices survival required. To condemn all as traitors ignores the impossible moral dilemmas they faced. To excuse all as victims ignores the agency they exercised and the harm they caused. The truth is that the Osttruppen were both victims and perpetrators, caught in a situation that offered no good choices. The Soviet treatment of former Osttruppen continued long after the war ended. Those who survived initial imprisonment and were eventually released from the Gulag faced lifelong discrimination. They were denied veteran status and the modest benefits that status provided. They could not speak publicly about their wartime experiences. Their service in German uniform marked them and their families with a stigma that persisted for generations. Only in 1995, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, did Russia formally recognize former Soviet POWs as veterans entitled to equal rights with other war participants. The opening of Soviet archives after 1991 allowed historians to document the full scale of collaboration and of subsequent repression. The revelation that approximately 1 million Soviet citizens had served Germany, and that hundreds of thousands had been executed or imprisoned upon repatriation, sparked intense debate in Russia and Ukraine. Nationalist historians argued that many Osttruppen had been patriots fighting against an oppressive regime. Liberal historians emphasized the moral complexities and the tragedy of ordinary people trapped between two totalitarian systems. Official Russian historiography, increasingly influenced by nationalist sentiment, has generally condemned the collaborators while acknowledging that Soviet policies created the conditions that made collaboration possible. In Ukraine, the historical assessment has been complicated by post-Soviet politics and by the Russian-Ukrainian conflict that began in 2014. Some Ukrainian nationalists have attempted to rehabilitate Osttruppen, particularly those from Ukrainian units, as fighters for national independence. Russian propaganda has responded by equating modern Ukrainian resistance to Russian aggression with World War II collaboration with the Nazis. The historical record has thus become a weapon in contemporary political struggles, with both sides distorting the complex reality to serve present purposes. The eternal question posed by the Osttruppen story is one of moral responsibility under conditions of extreme duress. When faced with the choice between certain death and collaboration with an enemy, what is the ethical response? Is survival itself a sufficient justification for choices that lead to violence against one's own people? Can we judge men who chose to live when the alternative was to die of starvation in a frozen pit? These questions have no universal answers. They depend on individual circumstances, on the specific choices made, on the extent of participation in atrocities. A starving prisoner who volunteered to drive a truck for the Germans occupies a different moral position than an officer who enthusiastically led anti-partisan operations that targeted civilians. Yet both were classified as traitors under Soviet law, and both faced the same punishment if captured. The legacy of the Osttruppen is one of erasure and rediscovery. For decades, Soviet historiography simply deleted them from the official history of the war. They were non-persons, traitors whose existence was acknowledged only as a cautionary tale about the consequences of disloyalty. Their families were silent, unable to speak about fathers and grandfathers who had served the wrong side. The full story remained hidden in classified archives, known to scholars but not to the public. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the opening of archives, the story began to emerge. Memoirs were published. Historians wrote detailed studies. Documentaries explored the moral complexities. Yet even now, the Osttruppen remain controversial and difficult to discuss in Russia and other former Soviet states. They challenge the comfortable narrative of the Great Patriotic War as a story of heroic resistance and ultimate victory. They reveal uncomfortable truths about the nature of Stalin's regime and the depths of popular discontent it generated. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph for the Osttruppen was written by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, himself a former prisoner who understood the moral compromises that survival in totalitarian systems required. He wrote that in the camps, every man faced choices between collaboration and resistance, between survival and principle, and that no one who had not faced those choices had the right to judge those who had. The Osttruppen made their choices under conditions of extremity that most people cannot imagine. They paid for those choices with their lives, their freedom, and their reputations. Whether history will eventually offer them understanding, if not forgiveness, remains uncertain.